That was well done. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dean Schellenhaus, for the kind introduction. You know, I don't belong here because I'm not a law scholar. We talked about that last night, and thanks again. I can't do Dutch last names, so to Helen and Martin and Ronald for making this possible. Let me start by saying that I'm here at some risk to my marriage. The way the timing worked out, so my wife and I are selling the house that our children grew up in. 4 children, big house, don't need a big house anymore. And we're moving to a house in the town next door. And as things would have it, she's moving the house while I'm here in Rotterdam for the first time. So, but fortunately, Lizzie is helping to bail me out on this. So we took a photo of me with my picture in the entrance to Erasmus Law School so that I can prove to my wife that I'm not on some kind of a boondoggle in my first time in Rotterdam. So that was good. And then I was feeling pretty good about that. And then things started to go downhill a little bit yesterday, and I started to get nervous because I went upstairs and they gave me a nice room, and it was the Oxford room, and I thought that's very appropriate. And at one point I went down to the men's room, and I'm walking out and my picture is on the door in the men's room. And I thought, well, it's a little odd, but, you know, I guess it's a marketing thing, you know, the Erasmus School of Law and Marketing or whatever. Then we're having these workshops yesterday, and this woman comes up to me during a break, and maybe she's here, it's hard to see everybody, and she kind of leans over and goes, you know, I have to tell you something, but your picture is on the door of the stall and, you know, everyone in the ladies' room. Then I started to get really nervous because you do that sort of thing in the United States in the post office for, you know, people that are wanted criminals. Then I'm thinking, okay, I'm not here for a lecture. I thought I was here for a lecture, but like I'm wanted by the police for something I did in Amsterdam on Monday and Tuesday. And there's all kinds of trouble you can get in Amsterdam, obviously, but I was good. I mean, I just met with people. So if the police come in here while I'm trying to give my non-lecture lecture, I think there's a door in the back. And so if you don't mind, I'll just scoot out. So I didn't pick the title. I think Ronald did. Will ESG investing survive its crucible? The answer is yes. It'll be better. The language will change. Are we good to go? I haven't seen anything in Rotterdam. I like to go out and see the city, so that's the answer to the question. So here's the deal. As I gave the group at dinner a heads up last night, this is not going to be a lecture. I'm going to tell you 4 stories, hopefully 4 stories. We'll get through 3. If we have time, we'll get to 4. And the stories are the sustainability reporting story. It's the first story. And I'll try and tell that story in about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a chat about it. Happy to answer questions. I've learned these little things that I'm supposed to toss at you, not throw at you, they said, but American football, I just may throw it at you. The second story is the purpose, sustainability, ESG, and impact story. And the third story is the ideology and language story. And if we get to the fourth story is the bridging the divide story. And we'll see if we get to that. As Harry had said in the beginning, sort of the good old days, being the guru of ESG was a good thing. Not so clear in the United States, you know, in certain states in particular, if being the dean of ESG is a good thing or a bad thing. So we'll kind of see how that goes. So let's start out with the sustainability reporting story. And it's kind of a personal one. I was at Harvard Business School for many years, and I was developing a new course called Information Organization and Control, and we're looking for cases. And I remember talking to this guy who was at Citibank. And this was like in the late 80s, right? This was like the Gordon Gekko days. And so you go into his office, and it's big office with a view, and there's the guy coming in shining his shoes and stuff like that, and you know, he was all full of himself. And I'm going, oh, you're looking for a case? And he goes, well, you know, what we're trying to do is trying to figure out other things to measure. Financial results are the rearview mirror, and, other things, customer retention, something, and I thought, that's kind of interesting, and I kind of bumped into that. So this is the late 80s, right? And I bumped into that with a couple other people, and I wrote a paper, little piece in the Harvard Business Review that was published in 1991 called the Performance Measurement Manifesto. I have a PhD in sociology. I tried to explain that to my parents. My mother said, oh, it's nice, dear, you're going to become a social worker. My father said, I don't like socialists. And it's like, well, neither one of those things, but, whatever. But I read a lot of Karl Marx and stuff when I was in graduate school. So, and the basic thesis of this paper was that companies are going to start to measure, and it was largely from an internal point of view, so-called non-financial things. And terms like materiality weren't used. And I published it, and a year later, Bob Kaplan published the Balanced Scorecard, which is basically the same idea, did it in a more elegant way. And, kind of things cook along. And so then I started thinking, well, I wonder if the markets care about this other stuff. And when I was an associate professor, I'd written a book on investment banks called Doing Deals at Work. So, what do these investment bankers do? So I was talking to some companies and said, well, you're trying to think about reporting on these non-financial metrics. And they go, yeah, but, these analysts, they don't care about it. Sell-side analysts, I went to Harvard Business School, learned these little models. It's your fault. They don't care about it. So, all I want to talk about is earnings. So we're going to talk about earnings. I said, okay. So I go and I talk to people, all these sell-side analysts, talk to some buy-side people, and I go, what do you think of this other stuff? They go, well, we think it's important, but companies never talk about it. All they want to do is talk about their earnings. So there was this communications gap that was going on. I said, well, that's interesting. And did a survey with a woman who was a doctoral student named Sarah Mavernack. It was a very simple survey. There was nothing elegant about it, but nobody had done it before. Came up with a list of about 10 so-called non-financial metrics. And it was human capital, intellectual capital, and customer retention and things like that. And we did a survey of companies and sell-side and buy-side people. And is this important? Everybody said it's important. And asked the market, the sell-side, the buy-side, are you getting this information? No. Would you like it? Yes. And companies, we think it's important. We're not reporting it. Systems aren't all that good. We don't have standards. And so it was kind of left that way. So, okay. Kind of planted some seeds. Then rattled around, did stuff at the Harvard Business School. So this is now 1995, the article's published. In 1997, the Global Reporting Initiative, which you all know about, gets started. It was started in Boston by two friends of mine, Bob Massey and Alan White, and it was quite an ambitious thing they did. Said, look, there's this financial reporting, but what about other stakeholders? There's information that they want, and they're not getting it. So they started the Global Reporting Initiative, and it's grown up a lot. In fact, one of the people I saw in Amsterdam was Elko van der Enden. He's a Dutch guy who's the CEO. He's doing some very interesting things with the GRI. So that was kind of interesting. So the GRI started, and then something called CDP, the Climate Disclosure Project, was started in around 2000. Then you've got 2007, I think it was. You had CDSB, that was the Climate Disclosure Standards Project. It was kind of modeled off of ISB and FASB. And then in 2010, the International Integrated Reporting Council gets started. That was kind of the integrated reporting stuff, and I was involved in that. And then in 2011, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board gets set. And the person who started it is a friend of mine named Jean Rogers. And she published this very interesting paper, and it was called From Transparency to Performance. And the basic idea was just being transparent about your sustainability performance. We'll come back to what that means. Is really not the issue. You need to be able to compare performance, just like you can compare financial performance. So we're going to start the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And what's material, what matters to value creation, to enterprise value creation, is going to be industry specific. So long story, I ended up being the founding chairman. I remember going into Bloomberg's offices, we've got to raise money. And we've got our little PowerPoint presentation. We go in to see Dan Doctorow, who was the CEO at the time. Bloomberg was mayor, and we're nervous, and could we please have $1 million? And I said, sure, no problem. That's a lot easier than I thought. Man, I just got $1 million, out of Bloomberg, that's fine. Why was it so easy? It wasn't easy over the long term. They were thinking about something similar, but they realized that a commercial organization really can't set standards. So you have an NGO that's out there, that doesn't have any commercial interest, and it's going to set the standards. And so they started, and they got us funding. And almost from the beginning, there was this kind of headbutting between SASB and GRI. And, the kind of GRI people is like, what do we need SASB for? And they kind of got mad at me, and it's a whole long story about that, but I'm used to people being mad at me, so that's okay. And the difference between the two, and this is playing out today, and I'll say more about this, is basically in the language of today, SASB was single materiality. It's like, what are these issues that matter to enterprise value creation? So that's how materiality was defined, very much in the context of financial reporting. GRI defined materiality as an externality. What they were interested in was the impact of a company on the planet, on people and planet, and that happens from its operations and activities, and it happens, I think, more so from its products and services. So this kind of launches off, and we're sort of going along. I had written a book called The Value Reporting Revolution, The Future of Corporate Reporting in 2001, so not all that long after the GRI had been started, and one of the authors was Bob Herz, who became chairman of FASB for 2 terms. That is a good friend of mine, and worked on this Norwalk Agreement, trying to reconcile FASB and on IFRS. And we published this, and I had a little chapter on the GRI, and was like, these are really quite separate things. GRI is over here doing stakeholder reporting, that's good. And here you've got the stuff for kind of the reporting on the stuff that I'd been studying, where we replicated the survey in other countries and other industries. The book sort of had no impact whatsoever. It was like the internet everything was going fine. Then the internet collapsed, and there was the Enron and the WorldCom trouble, so we published another book, Building Public Trust, and said, look, think of it this way. And there was all this focus on Sarbanes-Oxley. Let's have global GAAP. Let's integrate IFRS and, US GAAP. Then we'll have industry-specific metrics, and then at the top we'll have things that are company-specific. So when Jean came to me and she had this notion of we're going to create SASB and it's going to be industry-specific, I thought that's really good. So there's this long period of time from 1991, and I think you had 2014, I think, was the EU taxonomy, and 2015 was the TCFD, and then the CSRD was 2021. But if you look at it, there's about a 20-year period, maybe more, from 1990 to a 30-year period, where what you had was a whole bunch of NGOs trying to get into this domain of establishing standards and frameworks. And there's a difference. SASB was standards, the IRC, TCFD, they're a framework. It's just kind of an organizing framework, and they're not specific about what's the way you're going to measure any particular thing. And I go around to people, and NGOs, I mean, you think the commercial world, Hanukkah, is vicious. I mean, the NGO world is like unbelievable, because you've got all of these founders, and they're all mission-driven, and they're all a little crazy because they have to be, because they're not making enough money, and they're all trying to fight for the money from the foundations, and the foundations all support their NGO, and they don't want to merge, and there's no market forces to merge them, so it's like this Wild West. And people are getting confused. Companies are getting confused, and investors are getting confused, and then they don't like the ESG rating agencies, which is a whole other thing I'm not going to talk about. And I'm going, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could have standards for sustainability reporting like we have for financial reporting? Seems to make sense, right? We take them for granted, and I'll say more about that later. We take them for granted. And the reaction was, no. Market forces are going to sort it out. I'm like, right. Market forces are going to sort it out, particularly in the United States. We don't need any regulation. By God, market forces are going to sort it out. And I'm thinking, well, okay, let's see how that goes. So then with my colleague Richard Barker at Oxford, who's now one of the inaugural members of the International Sustainability Standards Board, we decide to write a so-called green paper. Do you know what a green paper is? I didn't know what a green paper was. It's this kind of British thing where you sort of write a paper and you say, here's an issue, and you could kind of do it this way, and you could kind of do it that way, and you don't really take a point of view, and then you sort of publish the paper, and then people are supposed to talk about it. So we published a paper called Should FASB and ISB Set Standards for Non-Financial Reporting? So we published the paper, and we interviewed a whole bunch of people, and then we did this big debate at the Oxford Union. It was like, very British and fancy and kind of cool and stuff like that. And the thesis was the House believes that FASB and ISB should set standards for non-financial reporting. And it was a heated debate, and one of the people that was on for the market side was Bob Herz, which is interesting. He's changed his mind. And the vote was about 2-1. So it was good, but it wasn't 90%, 10%. And they do it because you walk out of like one door or the other, and then everybody goes so pup and gets drunk and stuff, and so you forget kind of who said what. So that was fun. And so that's in 2018. Along the way, something called the Impact Management Project gets formed under a very brilliant British woman named Clara Barbie, who had been at Bridges, and then she was seconded. And so what they were trying to do was bring together these sort of cantankerous NGOs. It was SASB and GRI, and I think CDSB and IRC, and then I think the IBC-WEF, the International Business Council, the World Economic Forum. So it kind of brings them all together. And in 2020, they published a paper with a title something like, Towards a Comprehensive Framework of Corporate Reporting, which was a first step to try to kind of get to some set of standards. And at the same time, the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum had come out and they'd published their paper on stakeholder metrics, metrics for stakeholder capitalism. And out of the blue, the IFRS Foundation publishes their consultation to set up an International Sustainability Standards Board. And I thought, wow, And then I wrote a little piece in early 2021, which was, 2020, the year the narrative changed for corporate reporting. Big change. So basically what you had going on, and I should mention EFRAG, because I think the technical expert group was established in 2020, so a little bit earlier, and then they ended up establishing, their kind of sustainability reporting board, and there's all kinds of stuff behind that. But you had, and then in 2021, you had the SEC come out with its proposal. The ISSB has issued 2 standards, the consultation for the general requirements and for climate. EFRAG has come out with about 12 different standards. So it's this dramatic shift where you've gone from a bunch of NGOs that are, I think, doing good work from different perspectives, and it's now pretty much agreed to, not in the United States as much, we'll talk about that later, that you need to have regulation that's going to be around setting some standards for sustainability reporting. And there's differences because EFRAG, it's part of under the EU, so it's a state, it's a government, and they can require stuff. And ISSB is just a standard setter. So they can come up with standards, but they're going to be dependent upon governments to say, we want you to use these standards just like they have to recommend it for international financial reporting standards. And so it's kind of in early days. Standards have been issued. ISSBs are out there. The SEC's climate proposal is out there. EFRAG is going to publish its standards, I think, on November 16th, last I heard yesterday. And so I think all that's good. I really do think that's good. But let me make a couple of cautions. And I think I'm pretty much on time, and we'll end this story. I'm going to throw this at somebody randomly. So there's this single materiality, double materiality debate. And it came up a lot in the workshops yesterday. And it's a fundamental debate. It's an important debate. ISSB is single materiality, enterprise value creation. That's what their core competence is. They know how to set standards for investors. They don't have a multi-stakeholder process. The GRI has a multi-stakeholder process. The GRI has a collaboration agreement with ISB. I think that's good. Single materiality, okay. Double materiality is more what the impact is that the company's having on the world, both in terms of operations and activities and products and services, as I said. I think people need to be realistic about what can be done with standards. For one thing, even if you get to a global baseline, which is the goal, standards can only do so much, right? Standards aren't targets. Standards don't bring incentives. If you have standards and you have comparable ways of comparing a company's carbon emissions, just like you compare a company's profits or you can compare a company's revenues, that's only going to matter if targets are set and commitments are met, and companies do that with earnings, and then they do it in the United States, blah, 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 future projections, this and that, the other thing, all kinds of legalese, which I say with respect in a law school, I believe. Right? I believe in legalese. I think legalese is really good. And if executive compensation is tied to it, then that matters. If all we get is a set of standards and there's no link to compensation, and Helen and I have been talking about sort of links to compensation for non-financial metrics, then how much is it going to do? And if companies don't commit to net zero targets, and we can argue about whether they should or not, if we're in the United States, the standards are a starting point. I think they're important. Another thing I'd like to say about standards is they're a social construct, not a socialist construct. I don't want my father to be upset with me. God rest his soul. They're not a socialist construct. They're a social construct. They're not derived from the laws of physics, right? They're human inventions. And they're based on judgment. And IFRS is a social construct that people kind of say principles-based. And US GAAP is a social construct, and they say, well, it's more rules-based. And there was a Norwalk agreement to try and get them to come together that my friend Bob Herz I mentioned worked on, and they never really happened for a bunch of reasons that aren't important for this. So there's no right answer for a standard. There are maybe technically worse answers, and you're seeing that debate take place. You'll see it in the consultations when they answer. It's like, you should use the greenhouse gas protocol, don't use the greenhouse gas protocol, do scope 3 this way, do scope 3 that way. There's no definitive scientific answer to this. These are social constructs, just like financial reporting is a social construct, where we've basically agreed to say, this is how we're going to see the world. And we kind of say, okay, these are the revenues. We don't argue about it too much. These are the profits. But it's only a baseline to start from. So I'd like to end the first story with a little bit of history on financial reporting, which I'm not an expert on. In fact, most things I'm talking about today, I'm not an expert on. I just know a lot of people, and I try and kind of boil it all down into stories. So if you look, I wrote a little series with my colleague Kasby Soonawala, who is a real accountant at Said, and the first one was called The Long and Winding Road to Financial Reporting Standards. And I published it in this Harvard Law School forum on corporate governance blog. If you look at financial reporting, double entry bookkeeping goes back 600 years. That's a pretty solid foundation, 600 years. The International Chartered Accountant of England and Wales was established in 1880. And so that's a while ago. If you look in the United States, before the SEC was formed, there was a gazillion little accounting firms. They all had their own accounting standards. They all had their own auditing methodologies. Listed companies didn't have to report. A lot of them didn't report revenues. They said, oh my God, if I report my revenues, my competitor's going to know this and the sky is going to fall. And so then you get the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and the SEC is when they're saying things aren't going along all that well. We need to protect investors through transparency. We're going to have accounting standards. And it was agonizingly politically contested. The auditing firms said, this is as much, art as science. You can't really kind of come up with standards. And the company said, you're going to make a report on this stuff. So, okay, we get it done. And then it kind of rolls along. And then you've got you folks in Europe, You've got all your little country gaps. There's Dutch country gap and English country gap and Italian country gap and all these country gaps and So then it's like, well, that's not working so well. So then there's the International Accounting Study Committee or whatever it's called in 1990-something. And I think 2000, not that long ago, the International Financial Reporting Standards get set under the International Accounting Standards Board. So look at how long it took to get to accounting standards, and we still haven't merged US GAAP and IFRS. Think about that in terms of sort of FRAG and the ISSB. The second piece was the complex, contentious, and ever-changing nature of financial reporting. So you talk to people, certain SEC commissioners, they go, oh, this sustainability stuff, it's not real, and it's got a grounded materiality, you've got financial reporting, you know exactly what you're doing. Man, that's like so wrong. Have you looked at what happens with, how financial reporting standards are set? Man, they go back and forth, and I don't know how many times they've changed the reporting for financial instruments and goodwill. It's, write it all off, you amortize it, you do an impairment test, and then there's income, And then there's other comprehensive income. So there's the bottom line and there's like the other bottom line. And, it's just kind of ongoing. And it will always be ongoing. It's never done. So you've got to be practical about that in terms of sustainability reporting. Last point, this is like a little peek into the future. The piece, putting a practical perspective on financial reporting standards. So you come up with these standards, and companies complain. Oh, we don't disclose this, and investors want more than the companies want, and it's expensive, and it's hard, and we're going to get sued, and all this and that and the other thing. Okay, right. Then you look at their investor presentations, and they're like providing on a voluntary basis all this information they don't have to provide. They're like giving you profits by market segment and product line and cash flows and projections and this and that and the other thing. And they've got non-GAAP measures, because everybody thinks you need, and they say, well, the GAAP thing, it's a standard, but look, my circumstances are different. Stock compensation, and I did this acquisition, and here we are, the way they handle investments in intangible assets, they're all expense, the R&D, and really should be amortized, but the accounting's stupid and doesn't do it. So here's what our non-GAAP earnings are. You watch for non-GAAP carbon emissions. I can almost guarantee it, right? Because I think you can look at what's happened with financial reporting and say, why should it be any different with sustainability reporting? We are starting with a much less well-established conceptual base like you have with double entry bookkeeping. So I went on a little bit too long, so let me stop the story on sustainability reporting standards, and we'll open it up for some questions, and then we'll move on to the next story. Any questions? Yes, sir. Wait, hold on. You're close enough, but I want to do this because, you're like, I think I can do it. You ready? You good? All right, man.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good.
Professor Eccles, I think it's a small world because some of the people you mentioned in your talk, including Bob Massey and others, actually, I used to write about GRI in the late 2000, about 2009 with Helena Brown. I don't know if you ever met her. She gave a guest lecture at Harvard on the very same topic. We studied GRI. We interviewed a few people, including Bob Massey at his home. And we were excited in the early days about this emerging. But as our research went on, we increasingly consider the title The Rise of the Reporting Industry. The reason being that we thought, well, this is a perfect tool for the big four consultancy and accountancy firms to increase their business. This is basically a tool in their hands so they can offer their services at high costs to other companies to report on something. And at the same time, if I look at it very viciously, then it is the best way to make people believe you're doing something for the environment and something for the social by writing a report. Sometimes the real activity staying behind. And that this could be one of the reasons actually why we're still talking about sustainability and we're still talking about social, because not enough has happened. And this reporting industry, we didn't give it that title in the end. We published it luckily under a different name. But that basically it's rather been a tool for the consultancy industry than a real instrument to change something. I know it sounds very cynical, but I would still like to have your view of it.
Come on, man, toss it back.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So two good points. Let me, I'm not with you so much on the first one as I am on the second one, and I'll tell you why. Or maybe that's just the capitalist in me, because I just remember I'm not a socialist. All right, it's important that I can't go, I'm not a socialist. If the companies think there's value and they want to pay for it, and then the people are the users of it, and it gets complicated with the users, then it's like, okay, they can make that decision. So I'm less fussed about that. And to be honest, and I know the big four accounting firms pretty well. I know the accounting industry pretty well. They're not making much money, doing stuff with GRI reporting. I mean, kind of what their money is on the consulting businesses and the stuff that they do for the financial audit. I think the other point is, is a more profound one, because it kind of gets into the stuff I'll talk about in the second story. who's the audience for GR reporting? The audience has typically been stakeholders, right? And when I talked to Bob about it, they very consciously didn't involve investors in the beginning because they said, investors have got the ISB and FASB to go to that. It kind of begs a question, and this is for the law professors in the room, around corporate form. And this is why I think you need to be careful what you expect from reporting. Because if the corporate form is where most company law is that, your fiduciary duty is to the company. It's not solely to the shareholders, it's to the company. Shareholders are important. If there isn't a duty of the board that with respect to the externalities, which I think is your concern, that are being created by the company, then I don't see how any kind of reporting is going to change that. So what you're going to get with GRI is NGO pressure. And then if that starts to align with investor pressure, you're going to get some change. But I would agree that I think, for the most part, what you have, and you can look at it in terms of, it's like Animal Farm, right? In Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And it's that like in companies, the CFO is like, a more equal animal than the CSO. And just on the investor side, the portfolio manager is a more equal animal than the ESG and the proxy voting people. So a lot of lip service is being paid, I think, on the part of companies. They kind of put out their sustainability report every year, and it really doesn't have anything to do with capital allocation. It's not kind of integrated in strategy, and they never talk about this stuff in their investor presentations. So on that part, I'm good with you. And I think that's why this debate between the ISSB and FRAG is important, because the thesis under FRAG is that, okay, we're going to address these issues, it's going to be regulated, and we're going to have to make companies report on it, but it still goes back to this, issue of incentives and targets. And if the state wants to get information that investors don't find relevant, which they can as the state, then my question is, are they going to be using this information to create changes that companies have to adhere to in terms of various kinds of laws and legislation, whether it's on environment or labor practices? Because you could say we're using this information and we're going to pass laws that companies have to reduce their carbon emissions. We're going to pass laws around paying a living wage, but that's something that's not going to fall out of the reporting by itself. So this is going to be, this is like, a running back thing. So you can just...
Thank you. Thank you very much for your introduction, your speech, Professor Eccles. You made a brief reference to the wording stakeholder capitalism. And that reminds me of the statement of the Business Roundtable in the US in 2019. That statement, of course, statement on the purpose of a corporation. And the message was very clear. We should not serve only the interests of the shareholders, but of all stakeholders. So there must be a connection between stakeholder capitalism and that statement. My question to you is, what has happened? Because we have had the statement. Did it really lead to changes in the US? Are companies reporting in another way? What's the significance of such a statement when you talk about reporting activities?
Since you're not American, I don't expect you to know how to hand it off to the fullback or something like that. The short answer is no. No. And it's puzzling, because when you look at it, I wrote about this a little bit. So there's a lot of fanfare. So this is our biggest change, in corporate governance since, the 1997 white paper, whatever, which was very much, kind of shareholder capitalism. The Wall Street Journal freaked out, as they usually do on these sort of things. I'll talk about the Wall Street Journal more later. But here's the curious part. So there's a friend of mine who's a professor at Harvard Law School named Lucian Bebchuk. And very interesting guy. People think he's kind of anti-stakeholder capitalism. I don't think he is. I think he's just anti-faux stakeholder capitalism. So he did this study to find out how many people ran this by their board of directors. I'm thinking, if this is like the greatest thing since sliced bread, and it's one of the most important changes in corporate governance, for the last 20 or 30 years, whatever the numbers are, you'd want to run it by your board. Almost nobody did. And then you go and you say, well, why don't you run it by your board? It's like, we've always been doing this stuff. We always paid attention to customers and employees. It's like, the dog don't hunt. Because, if you've already been doing it, then why are you making such a big deal that you came out with the statement? And if it really is a big deal, why didn't you think you had to run it by your board? And a lot of that is you have these imperial combined, chairman and CEO. So to not be too cynical, do I think it was sort of an indication of trying to move in the right direction? Yes, but did it really have any teeth behind it that I saw? No. Was it linked to reporting? Was it linked to incentives? I didn't see anything, and now it's all, kind of part of the brouhaha that if we get to my third story, we'll talk about that. But I think it's a good question. But I think it's been kind of a non-event so far. Anything else? Man, this is so much fun. I've never seen one of these before. I want to see if I can get it to somebody way in the back.
Well, thank you. And also thank you for your very insightful observations so far.
So far.
I have to have
Well,
the others.
well, thanks a lot.
Cannot judge that already.
Man, it's downhill from here. What's your name? Where do you live?
No, but I feel that the effectiveness of standards, because I think you very rightly said that standards in themselves are not incentives. So, but that the effectiveness of the standards, amongst other things, also hinges on the question whether they can be measured and how they are measured. And now my question especially relates to the measuring of the S. Because what I feel there is that we, at least until now, mainly measure what companies do in terms of trying to establish, for example, due diligence, prevent human rights violations, mitigate environmental impact, but not so much on the results, especially not in terms of human rights issues, for example. And so, wouldn't it be better if the measuring methods in terms of the S should be adapted and also, or at least try to measure instead of activities of companies, more measure results? And currently some methodologies are developed to do that. And so are we, to put it briefly, not measuring the wrong thing in connection with the S?
So when you say actions versus results, so be specific about that in a human rights context.
Well, for example, in terms of what happens with measuring, is that we send questionnaires to companies and say, well, what are you doing to prevent, for example, human rights impact? And then, they kind of fill in all kinds of questions and then ask themselves, well, what do the board want to hear, or what do I kind of self feel we are doing? But they do not survey rights holders what's happening. So whether these activities indeed result in something for the rights holders on the ground.
Yep. No, good question. So there's a group called SHIFT that's run by a friend of mine named Caroline Reese, and they're very focused on human rights. And one of the issues that's coming up with the ISSB is they're going to do a consultation on what are the things that we should do in the next, and one of them will be S. Human rights comes up a lot. What you're talking about is sort of reporting on having policies. I mean, it's good to have policies and how they're being enforced. What you'd want to know is violations. Then where you're going to get the data on violations if you're kind of talking about results. I think human rights is an issue in social. When you talk to large institutional investors, they say the systemic issues are climate change and income inequality, because that leads to polarization and the breakdown of the multilateral order, and they're related to each other because the most disadvantaged will be the most impacted. And in one of the workshops yesterday, we had a lot of talk about the living wage. And it's a really fundamental issue, and how one implements that if you're a company in an industry that's competitive. I think there's questions around what are the methodologies, but I think kind of talking about policies and procedures, that's kind of just the framework baseline. I think I agree with you need to have data. But then that got you into, are investors, will it clear the bar of single materiality that you're violating human rights? Some people say, well, I'm being cynical about it. So I don't really know, and it's in the supply chain. You go down to tier 4, and how are you going to find out about it? But what this keeps coming back to, and it's the question that the first gentleman asked, and it's the fundamental question, I think it's missed a lot in terms of reporting, which is what is the role of the corporation in society? And that gets back to company law, and it gets back to something in the United States we call the public benefit corporation, where if you look at company law, my colleague, Colin Mayer's written about this in this brilliant book called Prosperity, Better Business for the Greater Good. This construction we have of a corporation, that it can be an entity that can do pretty much whatever it wants to and live forever, that's fairly recent, it's the end of the 19th century. Before that, it was like, okay, you get to build this canal and you collect the tolls for 30 years and then wrap it up, boys and girls, and, go do something else. And there's been so much concentration of economic power in the really large companies. And we've got this issue I'll talk about a little bit more later. What should the public sector do? What should the private sector do? I think it's time to rethink company law. right? Because you're trying to force changes in behavior within a constraint of company law that kind of doesn't lend itself that way. On a public benefit corporation, the company has to identify the benefit that it wants to create, and then in a US context, the shareholders will hold the board responsible for achieving that benefit, just like they hold them responsible for financial performance. And I find this discussion of company law and corporate form, my friend Susan McCormick, who's with Warren Forster in California, that's missing a lot in the reporting world. There's this kind of fight going on about single and double materiality, where I think the deeper issue is company law, and that tends to get missed. So why don't we do the second story? I'll try and make the second story shorter. If I make the second and the third, and if I get to the fourth story really short, we can be out of here in 10 minutes, and I can go see Rotterdam. I haven't seen anything in Rotterdam. I can go see the market. And I am staying in the New York hotel. I feel like I'm on a cruise ship without being on a cruise ship, which is good because I don't like cruise ships. I think it's stupid. But if you like cruise ships, I apologize. So the second story is the story of purpose, sustainability, ESG, and impact. So words we use all the time. Nobody really knows what they mean and how they're related to each other and all this stuff. So let me take my whack at this. Talked about the statement of purpose. So my colleague Colin Mayer, who I just mentioned, he said, the purpose of a company is to solve solutions for people and planet in a profitable way. Companies don't exist just to make profits. Companies exist to solve problems of people and planet in a profitable way. That's purpose. And don't make the world a worse place when you're doing so. That's the sustainability. I'm going to unpack sustainability a bit more later. So, okay, that's good. And I wrote a little piece called The Difference Between Purpose and Sustainability, aka ESG, with Colin and Judith Strolla, who is a researcher. She's now at St. Gallen. And we sort of compared Unilever and Keynote. And it was interesting because this activist hedge fund, Blue Bell, had come in and they kind of bounced out, Manuel Faber, who's now the chairman of ISSB. And it's kind of funny, small world, how these things rattle around. But if you look at the stock price performance, and Unilever is a storied company when it comes to sustainability, but their stock price performance, you look at over 10 years and you look at it according to an industry index, has been really good. So they're kind of getting it both right. And with the known, it was more problematic. So in a lot of ways, they're regarded as good in sustainability, but the financial performance wasn't as great, and you have to have the financial performance if you're going to be able to be an ongoing organization to solve problems of people and planet and then deal with externalities. So I think, okay, I get that. That's sort of pretty clear, but I'll come back to sustainability. What about ESG? I don't know if I want to be, Harriet, the guru of ESG. Here's the story of ESG. 10 years ago, you go to people and you go, what do you think of ESG? What? Oh, ESG. What's ESG? Oh, it's environmental, social, and governance. What's that? And you sort of explain it. And then a company goes, well, sounds like philanthropy, I don't like it, and I'm going to lose money. And you go to an investor, unless they're a socially responsible investor, and they go, nah, I don't like it. It's going to make me lose money. Okay, so ESG is, kind of the second-class citizens that I talked about in Animal Farm, and, they're kind of the nice little people down in the boiler room, and the CFO is up in the top executive suite and has got all these resources, and they get their 1.5 time FTE, so they can kind of push out a little sustainability report every year, and there's this nuclear détente between the sustainability people and the CEOs. We're not going to trash ESG, but we're not going to give a lot of resources, and so, just don't whine too much and do your sustainability report. Then it kind of goes along, and SASB gets started, and people start doing research. I did a little paper with a guy named George Serafine. He'd be a great person to have come here. Who'd be less nervous about coming to the Netherlands because he's Greek, so he's not worried about being with people like you, so that'd probably be okay. And he's married to a woman who's Spanish, so I think it'll be fine. And so we did a little paper looking at 90 high sustainability, 90 low sustainability firms, and it's, empirical paper, and it's correlation, not causation. High sustainability firms, over time, their financial performance is better, stock returns, counting numbers, all the usual stuff. Perhaps more interesting, their behavior was different. They had executive compensation, tied. There was more competence, on the board around sustainability stuff. There was much more stakeholder engagement. It was really interesting, much more stakeholder engagement. So that was kind of one of the first papers that said, well, maybe this is not such a bad thing. Then he did with Aaron Yoon and a guy named Muzaffar Khan this lovely paper where they took basically the SASB guidance and kind of one of the earlier frameworks, and they kind of looked at the material issues, and they demonstrated that if you're performing well on what SASB would regard as material for that particular industry, SASB's got 11 sectors, subdivided into 77 different industries. If you were performing well on that, your financial performance was better. If you were performing really well on immaterial issues, not necessarily so. Those, you're not going to like this, those that were best financial performance, the companies that were performing well on the material issues and poorly on the immaterial issues. So, and you can kind of get it, right? It's like there's 25 things in the SASB thing, and 25 is a lot of stuff, and any company's got limited resources, and so you can't do everything, and it's not nice to say, but there's trade-offs, and it's very industry specific, and so it's safety in clinical trials, and pharmaceutical company means nothing in a bank. So, SASB's got this thing laid out that was developed by companies and investors. And so then it was like, oh, that's good. That's good. ESG contributes to financial returns. Narrative shifts. Just like the narrative shifted in sustainability reporting, market forces are going to solve it. Nope. We need regulation, so we're going to argue about who's doing the regulating. It kind of shifts for ESG investing, and it's like, it's great. Makes sense. Material risk factors, if you're managing the material risk factors well, sure, it should be better in terms of financial performance. I'm good with that. Then it went too far. Like everything in life, it went too far. So you started having these funds come out and they go, you know what? This ESG investing, it's the bomb. Not only can you make more money, you can save the planet. You can save the world. Who wouldn't want that trade? Like, gosh, I put my money in this fund, and I'm going to make more money, and I'm going to make the world a better place. At the same time, now I don't have to feel guilty, when I'm getting my dividend checks, out of this portfolio. But you know what? Life isn't that way. Because what got confounded when that bridge was crossed was the difference between ESG integration, managing the material risk factors from a single materiality, enterprise value creation point of view, and impact, which is about kind of positive and negative externalities. And largely today, this is being framed through the lens of the SDGs. And if you look at material risk factors, industry specific, largely, as I've said, companies' operations and activities. So doing a good job managing your material risk factors keeps the world from being a worse place, but it doesn't necessarily make the world a better place. What makes the world a better place is the products and services that you're having that could be sort of solutions to, if you want to frame it in terms of the SDGs. And these are analytically quite separate. And the example that I like to use, it's a made-up example, so it's not a very good example, but it's the only example I've been able to think of. And we're going to go with that example because I haven't had time to think of another example because I keep wishing I could go out and see Rotterdam, but then I can't. So think of a windmill company. It's not a bad thing. Wind energy, positive externality, less carbon. You could have a wind energy company that has got a supply chain that has, human rights violations, and you could have people falling off the ladders and killing themselves when they're putting up the windmills, and you can have, gender disparity in terms of representation in the board and management. So you can have all kinds of things that are sort of ESG operations and activities that are not being done well, and you're still producing a positive externality, and I'll come back to another example later. So then you had funds like DWS shouldn't say this, but I am. Is this Chatham House rules? You're going to put this whole thing, in public domain? You know what? I don't really care. You got Deutsche Bank that owns 80% of DWS. This is like the bank that can't shoot straight. Every time I turn around, Deutsche Bank is doing some other, bizarre thing. So they've got this asset management business, and it's like 70% of our funds are green. It's like, whatever. And there's a woman, an American, but she speaks German, however she learned that. Most of us are proud that we don't speak another language, to tell you the truth. We only need to speak English, and we're glad you do. You're almost like honorary Americans since you speak English. So she's like looking at this stuff. She's the head of sustainability. She's going, this dog don't hunt. They're saying all these things, and it just doesn't make sense. And so she's kind of taken this up to the board, and it's all been written about in the papers, and she's become a good friend of mine. I've written about it. So they try and throw her under the bus, right, in this kind of dramatic way. And, it kind of rattles around and rattles around. And a year later, 50 German police come and raid, the offices of Ahsoka Warman, and, the dude's gone. Just to put Deutsche Bank in perspective, since it's already in the public domain, I might as well rant on about this a little bit. And they can sue me because that's what we do in America, and that's all right. But this is just a fact. So I don't know how you can get upset about facts. So I'm like writing about this, with Desiree. We wrote this thing, 7 principles for ESG investing. How do you make it authentic? Germany is the 4th largest company in the world by GDP. Deutsche Bank is the 72nd largest bank in the world by market cap. So we've got regional banks that are bigger than Deutsche Bank, okay? So thank you for letting me get that off my chest. So then you have this kind of pushback that's happening, and people are going, gee, there's a lot of misrepresentation that's happening here. And so earlier in the week, my friends at the FCA came out with their proposal. You've got SFDR, and we can argue about whether there's fund labeling or moving capital, but there's this effort now to try and put some authenticity into fund labeling, and I'm hoping to make more of a distinction between ESG integration and basically solutions for people and planet, the products and services. And I think as part of that, you need to be clear about the difference, and we talked about this some in the workshop, between value and values-based investing. So if you look at traditional socially responsible investing, that was values-based investing. It was a lot of church groups, and they said, we don't want to own stocks in tobacco companies or alcohol companies or adult entertainment companies or oil and gas companies, and we don't care if we're going to give up any return because we just morally don't feel good about that. We don't want to be making money off of companies that are doing these things, and it's fair enough, absolutely fair enough. It's your money. Value-based investing, you're saying, look, we're excluding this sector because we think it's just, kind of a shitty sector, and its stock's going downhill, or we think this is a bad company or whatever, but it's from a value point of view, and those things tend to get confounded. And I wonder about that, when you have these funds that are, okay, outcome funds, is this value or values-based investing? And there's a politics of values-based investing, which became clear to me. I wrote a little piece with a professor at Penn Law School. I do hang around with some lawyers. I wrote a piece with a professor at Penn Law School named Jill Fish, who's great. And we kind of were looking at what's going on in the States, and if we get time to the 4th story, we'll talk about the States. Point Bridge, Put America First Fund. MAGA. Isn't that fabulous? The MAGA ETF. Point Bridge, Put America First Fund. Man, I like it. MAGA. It was launched in 2020. The thesis of MAGA is that we are going to exclude companies that don't have Republican values. You can support your Republican values by investing in MAGA. Okay. So there's always a pretty simple screening criteria when you're creating an exclusionary-based fund, and it's like, you have to have, donated a certain amount of money to Republican PACs, and you got to have at least half of your revenues based in the United States or something. So I've looked at the holdings of MAGA. 75 basis points, for any of you that know what that means, 75 basis points? I mean, that's like a lot for an ETF. ETFs are like 5 to 10 basis points. So this is like an expensive fund. Last I looked, it had about $13 million. It's like you can't even notice $13 million in an ETF. Just a couple years later, I think it went to 17. But then, and this is more the entertaining part, this is not the content part of the story, this is the entertaining part of the story. I looked at the top 10 holdings, Republican values. And one of them is a company called Constellation Energy, and the other is a company called Next Era Energy. And I looked them up, and both of them proudly proclaim on their websites that they are leading America to a net zero future. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, there you go. We also talk about the S&P Catholic Values Fund. Exclusions based on, does companies, follow Catholic values or not? They're very clear. This is a values-based fund. You may be giving up some return, if you invest in this, but, that's fine, it's your money. They're both, ironically enough, socially responsible investment funds, just kind of different definitions of what's socially responsible. If you want to have funds like that, and you're clear that you may be giving up some return, that's okay. Like I said, it's up, people can invest their money wherever they want to. Part of the debate in the United States is, this whole thing around values, and values is getting confounded. And you see that around climate. So we'll end this story with some meetings I had on Tuesday in Amsterdam. I was working in Amsterdam. Don't have the police come after me. I didn't do any bad things in Amsterdam. I don't know why my pictures are in the stalls and all the bathrooms here in this building. It's a little weird, but okay. So I met with a woman named Claudia Cruz. It's like the global head of stewardship at APG. She's great. I've known her for a long time. And then I went out and saw some folks at PGM and gave a little talk. So I'd followed this in the beginning, and Claudia said, there's something called the Sustainable Development Investment Platform, Asset Owner Project, which is fascinating, because where they are is it's a very clear distinction between ESG integration and outcomes, where they're saying we have a methodology that a group has put together and involves some asset managers, interestingly enough, BlackRock and Bridgewater, where they've created a fund on this at PGM where they say, look, we can assess what the outcomes are that a company is having, positive and negative, its impact, its externalities. And we think that investing in this is consistent with our fiduciary duty. So just like the question of fiduciary duty in company law and the board of directors, who is your duty to, and what is really following your fiduciary duty, is paying attention to other stakeholders part of fiduciary duty, are you violating your fiduciary duty? You have the same thing on the investing side. And I think that's very interesting, because when you look at it, as I understand it, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but Dutch fiduciary duty for investors is really no different than it is in the United States. You need to take account of the long-term interests of your beneficiaries. And so what is in the long-term interest of your beneficiaries, and some judgments has to be made. The thesis that, your large pension funds and others that might be involved, said, no, look, you do the ESG integration, but then companies that are producing these positive solutions to people and planet, those returns are going to be good, and they've got a very long-term view. And so what I think this illustrates, and then we'll kind of get this more in the third story, is this notion, just like standards are a social construct, fiduciary duty is a social construct, at least in terms of how you think it being implemented. So let's end the second story there, and I'd be happy to throw this football to anybody in the room. Oh man, this is fabulous. Okay, I'm going to do this. I really am. Ma'am, you should probably pay attention. Yeah, so like heads up, in case I can't get it that far. Are you good? We ready? All right, man. Okay, good job.
All right, thanks a lot, Professor. I would like to ask you about the shareholder-stakeholder debate that has been going on for a long time.
Yep.
So imagine we have all the information, the sustainability reporting in place, but you're saying the incentives will still lack. in the end, it will come down at the purpose of the company. All the companies play a vital part in society, in the ecosystem of society. But as we see the companies right now, they mostly serve the shareholders with more dividend payouts. We saw ING yesterday, large Dutch bank, with a new repurchase program. Could you elaborate a little bit on the role of a company and the role it plays in the society?
So I don't want to duck the question because I think that is the question. You know, right now, the way company law is established and what the fiduciary duty of the boards are, and you know, if ING is making these decisions and they think it's in the best interest of the corporation to be paying out more dividends than investing in something else, you know, I don't know if you've got the same thing as the business judgment rule here in the Netherlands, the way you do in the United States. That's completely their call. And so as long as that's the case, unless you get, and again, this is something that Helen and I talked about, unless you have executive compensation that's being tied to accomplishing other objectives other than financial returns, I wouldn't expect that to change too much. But then you're going to deal with this tension between, are the investors going to be supportive of having some percentage of executive compensation being tied to other outcomes, whether it's environmental or social, where they say, that's not your job. You know, that's not your job as a company. You know, that's what the state is. And so what we've got is this big debate going on. It's a global debate, and it's maybe more heated in the United States. What is the role of the corporation in society? And because you've got these companies that have gotten really big, and because governments are sort of, you know, failing in a number of different ways on these policies, there's this expectation that somehow the private sector is going to bail us out. You know, these big asset managers, you know, 5, 7 of the top 10, I think, are in the US, 14 of the top 20, so we're going to think about that. Is that a reasonable expectation to have? And that's the question. And I have NGO friends that are sort of putting pressure on the investors and putting pressure on the companies. And that's great because, you know, kind of where change comes from is basically NGO pressure and investor pressure. And those don't always line up. And by the way, the NGOs don't always line up with each other because they have different objectives. And there's trade-offs. There's a paper that my friend Bhakti Merchandani, there's trade-offs between environmental and social objectives. And I think if we could just have a more candid conversation about this, it would be good. But I think it's being ducked in lots of ways. So this is risky because if this thing breaks, you know, I don't have any insurance on it, but, you know, let's try it. And it looks like it's in foam. So if I don't get this, I'm sorry, but throw it.
This is tricky.
Oh, wait, this is even better. Throw it to this woman here. That's safer. Oh, come on.
Yes, that's so easy.
Come on.
I'm making it easy for you. On this note, recently another paper came out in American Academy of Management on that we require a stakeholder view on corporate governance, a stakeholder theory for corporate governance, and that's been lacking. Stakeholder theory, we'll know it. Do you think that when we look at the academic discussions going on, that stakeholder theory needs to be further developed within this idea of corporate governance and within the accounting research papers on what that will look like for this fiduciary duty, but also for accounting and reporting?
So, do you think you can, like, try and throw that back, or are you
Yeah,
going to hand it to somebody and, oh my God,
That's okay.
I'm going to try. Oh, it's your fault. It's okay, you're Dutch, you don't have to know how to throw a football. So in terms of the research on stakeholder theory, I think it's hard. I don't see what the research is going to do until the company law changes, as have been talked about. And so for me, the question would be, and I'd love to get sort of a lawyer, you know, law professor's view on this, is that stakeholders, and I know the early stakeholder theory, some people talk about it a lot, but I just don't see yet until that's kind of the governance and the application of stakeholder theory. It's a little bit different in Germany. You can have works councils and you can have representation on the board from particular groups. But broadly speaking, you know, as long as company law remains the way it is, and it's not kind of stakeholder law. I mean, like company law says you can take account of other stakeholders, but it doesn't say you necessarily have to resent other stakeholders, as I understand it, you know, and that they have a voice in it, and you can argue about whether that's a good idea or bad idea. There's that issue, and then I think if you did have that, and you had kind of stakeholder theory implemented in company law, it would have tremendous implications. for corporate reporting, because it would take a whole bunch of stuff that's called single materiality and make it double materiality. But law professor should help bail me out here. Do you agree with this or not? Any law professor? Okay, hold on. You're a new law professor, so.
Yeah, so I don't know much about it yet. Yeah, thank you for everything you said so far. A little bit in the same vein, you have discussed a lot compensation as an important part of incentivizing board members and management. But at the same, the question is, I read this, I have seen the TED talk of Barry Schwartz, and he actually said, why do people work? Not necessarily for their compensation. So what does intensify people? And one of the issues we have in the Dutch environment, Dutch bigger companies, Dutch corporate law, is this issue of culture. So do we really not need to change the culture of what do we find important on the board level and below? And in the Netherlands, we have a board which supervises the Dutch Corporate Governance Code. They talk to actually all beer companies, listed companies, and try to get everybody into a discussion about, what is our role in society. And I believe that the top of the Dutch corporates, they really do kind of seek ways to improve the ways the companies act. Of course, they're also, stuck into dynamics with shareholders, other interest groups. But this whole thing of changing the culture rather than always saying incentivized by compensation, how would you look at that?
So, gosh, I don't know, because if you look at as I understand Dutch governance, you have sort of supervisory board and a management board. And when I read about it, it's like, okay, it's kind of a stakeholder. You're a lawyer. That's what I need as a lawyer. He's your colleague. Do you think stakeholder capitalism exists in the Netherlands? When you're talking about culture and the supervisory board? Or are you just basically the same as us, you just don't want to admit it?
I necessarily like the word a lot, but awareness of a responsibility for stakeholders other than shareholders, yes, there is.
So awareness is good. Translating awareness in decisions and capital allocation and trade-offs, that's the question. Martin?
Yes, so the debate about stakeholder and shareholder is a very broad debate, of course, so it's difficult to say. But the Netherlands is supposed to have the stakeholder model, the Rijnlands model. But in practice, you see that the behavior of big board members is a bit different because of all sorts of reasons.
Which it sounds like, when this gentleman was talking about ING, it didn't sound like stakeholderism to me, right?
And so, but I think the good thing is that the case law helps, in the Netherlands at least, also the board members, for example, takeovers. You can protect yourself pretty well in the Netherlands for a take. So that's one of the mechanisms that helps also.
But that's interesting. That would be where it's different in the States, because in a takeover situation, basically, the shareholders come first.
Yes, so that's
right, when it's
a very
change of
nuanced
control
situation. It goes too far to explain it, but there's a lot of more room. And the other thing is the strategy, for example, that's been to the highest court. Who decides on the strategy? And that's the board in the end of the day. It's not like shareholders are the owners. So there's a lot of case law. I think in the end we need also, except for case law, also legislation, maybe on a European level. That makes it also simpler. But so in theory we have the stakeholder model, but in practice you see often it's in the end of the day the shareholders that
I've been
count.
told, is this true that there is legislation in the EU being considered on company law?
Yeah, there's
Is
a
that
lot,
right?
Yeah.
And the nature of it would be what? Just to the extent it's known, the legislation would say, company law is what versus what it is now.
some sort of a legal obligation to consider stakeholder or ESG issues in their decision making. So
Okay.
it's actually not necessarily changing what exists in terms of legal construct yet,
Okay.
at least not from a Dutch perspective.
If you talk about Dutch context, let's say we have you mentioned the corporate governance code. And in that code, you will find the reference to the long-term value creation. So all board members are supposed to be in line with this notion. The question is, how do you define it? How can you make it more actionable? That's true, but it is in the code. It's an important one. That's one. The second point, I fully agree with you. It's not, despite, let's say, apart from legislation or whatever, it has to do with your mindset. It's a matter of values. And I think if a company here in the Netherlands, if you don't have a good sustainability policy, you get difficulties because the public debate, because of legal actions and so on. So the world is really changing. And what I also notice is that there's a lot of irritation in this country about greenwashing, for example. Nice talks, but there's not a reality. This is changing. And that gives her some hope.
One small additional comment on ING, because the question is it really shareholder model if you do a repurchase program for shares, if you do higher dividends? I think the matter is more complicated than just deciding, oh, they do dividends, oh, they are anti-stakeholders, pro-shareholders. Let's not jump to that conclusion.
So, no. So don't hit them in the head. So like over their heads. Do it. No, right here. It's in the same row. You're in luck. No, come on, man. Oh, what a wimp. What a wimp.
Liability involved.
Man.
I have a bit of a different question, moving a little bit away from this debate. I was just wondering very broadly, but I'll elaborate a little bit, how do you see the role of the state and state-based regulation in this context? And from the regulation we've seen so far has been based on transparency, right? Reporting, so basically bringing information onto the market and then letting the market do its thing. So the assumption is still that the market actually works and will do something with that information, and that will lead to less negative impacts or positive impacts. Now, the next generation, I would say, of legislation that we're seeing being currently developed also at the EU level is different in the sense that it actually starts to regulate, it doesn't say to companies anymore, say what you do, but it's actually starting to regulate what companies are supposed to do. It's still process-based in the sense that you're supposed to have these processes in place to see where your negative impact is and to do something about it. So it's not impact. Obviously, with the idea that that would have a less negative or a positive impact. But this is a new generation of regulation. I was just wondering how you see that development. Is that something that you believe in will make a difference, or should we stick with just the transparency regulation, or maybe less regulation by the state?
No. Nice. So look, it's a really good question. It goes back to this fundamental issue of the role of the company in society. All the problems around, so having more transparency is good, and I can just repeat all the stuff I said before. So is that a positive step? Yes, just like it's a positive step to have financial reporting standards. Having legislation around, you need to have policies in place, and the board has to make sure through compliance that you've got human rights policies and things. I think that's good too. Then the next big question, so I'm okay with all that. And then the next question is, to what extent, do you want legislation to start to have very specific regulations about company behavior? And then have ways to find out and monitor and enforce whether they're, adhering to that behavior or not, kind of going back to the human rights issue. Or it can be things like, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just regulating behavior, what are the incentives that you'd have that would change behavior? And the example I always come back to, and it's not a silver bullet, for a whole bunch of reasons I won't get into, but is a carbon tax. Right? So say if we really want to sort of change behavior in carbon emissions, and if companies have to pay a carbon tax, if you could get that done and you have real carbon taxes and the markets for carbon taxes don't seem to be all that good, and my oldest daughter understands all these things and I don't, what are those sort of pinpoint parts of regulation that you could have to say that would really sort of change behavior? Because you're not going to change in the near term the corporate form, so let's go with the corporate form we've got and the incentives that exist in company law. But having a thing like a carbon tax would make a big difference. But and they tried it in Australia, then they backed off, and I don't know if there's any discussion about it in Europe, but I think we need to think more about that and kind of get away from this issue of, well, okay, let's not worry about kind of failure in public policy because the business community is going to bail us out. Because companies are big and asset managers are big. I just don't see that. And I think we're kind of, that debate is being ducked a little bit. So let me tell the third story, and I'll try and tell this one more quickly. Oh, boy, this is fabulous. So we're going to kind of do this like on a chain. You ready? You ready? You good? Nice.
So this was.
If you broke it, you own it.
I'm more concerned about the phone right now, but it's okay. It's intact. So this was more for your throwing skills than the question itself. But now that I have it, I have a question as well.
What a setup. All right, throw it back. I'll throw it to you if you really want to.
So I'm not sure how relevant this is, but just adding on to the regulation part about the EU taxonomy, can that be indirectly like incentivize the corporations? For example, like if you change the behavior of the asset managers, and that's what my perception is. So, would that make an impact? Because you talked about standards being just standards. And then if we incentivize the behavior of corporations by incentivizing asset managers, would that?
That was a big debate at one of the workshops yesterday, right? So you've got the EU taxonomy. You compare the EU taxonomy in the States. It's really interesting. Basically, the EU taxonomy said, we're going to kind of bet European competitiveness on creating a green economy. We're going to have this taxonomy, and we're going to have the CSRD and SFDR and stuff. I remain, on the asset manager side, I remain a cynic about SFDR 8 and 9. I think there's, kind of huge complicated problems in terms of how do you know whether something's Article 8 or Article 9 or not. I'm starting a research project with a bunch of data from Morningstar to see, kind of are there differences and how authentic. The part that I just can't get there, and maybe this is just my failing, I'm sure it is, it's always my fault. I don't see how calling something SFDR 9 moves capital. And it gets you back to the value versus values-based. I know it's supposed to be value-based investing, but if a fund, so I get it that you want to have authenticity and clarity and non-greenwashing in the labeling. I see that part of it, but I don't see, just like I have trouble with green bonds, is if it's a good investment, unless there's some additional thing that's put in there, you get a sort of top up or a discount or some backup by the government. If it's a good investment, why wouldn't you just do the investment in the first place? So I don't know how creating a category called SFDR 9 is going to move capital in a meaningful way. And by the way, just for the record, and you're not going to like this, I'm not big into exclusion. And a lot of this SFDR stuff is, okay, it's going to be based on, and you kind of see the argument in the EU taxonomy, is nuclear in or not, is natural gas in or not. And I think we need to have a more authentic conversation about that in this transition. So it's like you're not going to turn off all the, oil and gas, and there is a thing called, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and you need to think about coal, and I know it's not pleasant, and you need to think about nuclear, and I think it could be done in natural gas. And so it feels a little bit like well-intentioned, but it seems like there's some really practical parts of how things kind of work in the world that I'm not as convinced that that's going to move substantial amounts of capital, and I know people disagree with me. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to add on to that, I was just thinking, as you mentioned, that the fiduciary, the other financial standards took a century to, implement. So isn't that like just thinking about it, just debating on it, and just the whole process with the climate change, accelerating the whole process, basically, is moving in the right direction? Maybe not the direction we would like to be, like we would want to get to the solution faster than that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I think you could make that same point about the statement of purpose. You can say, okay, it's just, it's only been 2 or 3 years, so I should be consistent in my argument. I shouldn't be dumping on stuff that's only 3 years old when I just told you it took 600 years, to get financial reporting standards. So, okay, I'm wrong. This is a good point. No, I agree. We'll see. And they're not going to stop it. But it's kind of the nature of the conversation and how it progresses. And I think how it progresses will depend a lot upon, I'll go to my third story, How it progresses is going to be a function of ideology and language. So do you want to like stand up and throw that all the way down here all by yourself? Like, what are you going to do with that football?
I'm not sure how well insured this is, so I can do the chain again.
You're going to do the chain thing again?
Yep. Language, ideology, and the facilitating part. Yeah, that's your next part, right?
That's what I'm going to talk about. That's the third story. And we may not get to the fourth story. So the fourth story will be unknown. I'll try and tell this story really fast. And
I'm sure you want to.
oh, I give a spin on it to see if I could still get it, but I did. You know, Harriet's kind of actually giving you the good punchline on the third story, so I can be brief on that. Let me try and I'll tell you how I got to the topology of hate for ESG. So I went to MIT, and I was a math major, and like I was a really smart boy, and I wanted to be a pure mathematician, and I go to MIT, and like I'm a really smart boy, and I meet people that are so much smarter than I am. It's like there's no comparison. So they became pure mathematicians, and I wasn't good enough, so everything has been sort of plan B since then. But, you know, I'd like to be able to prove the four-color theorem and things like that. So, but I still remember my topology course from Professor Peterson. It's a long story on Professor Peterson, but it was pretty, what he did was just incredible. Maybe the short story, so in pure math, you survive on partial credit. And because he hated teaching undergraduates, he'd give us these exams, and it's like 10 questions, a house door space is a Tikhonov space, and you just say true or false. And if you got it wrong, he took off twice as many. And so if you just turn an exam in, you got a 0, and the class average was minus 40. And I was 40, so I thought I'd done pretty well, but there was some kid that got 100, and that's when I knew I had to get a different job. But I remembered some topology, and so topology, there's sets. So there's 4 sets, as Harriet said. You know, there's the sustainability Taliban, and there's the sustainability flat earthers, and then there's sustainability advocates, and there's this growing set of sustainability opportunists, who are the people who are out there doing the greenwashing and the funds, and then there's this smaller set of sustainability pragmatists. So here's kind of how this came about. I wrote the piece I told you about with Colin, the difference between purpose and sustainability, ESG. I posted on LinkedIn. I don't really understand LinkedIn. I post stuff on it, and if I get invited by somebody and they don't look like an axe murderer, I accept it, and then people send me invitations, they want to sell me shit and stuff, and so I just ignore all that. So it generates this incredible flood of hate mail. WTF, sustainability, ESG, for general audience, clarify the two-body problem, sustainability. Sorry if you want to kind of write a sort of rebuttal, and but did this die? That's sad. I've been talking too much. So I'm gracious about this, right? I'm a really nice guy. One of these people is Dutch, by the way, just so you know. So I let him post this on LinkedIn, and there's some more discussion. And this is great, and that's fine. A bit later, I write a piece with a woman named Bhakti Merchandani, who's vice president of responsible investing at Trinity Church Wall Street, and she's really smart. And we wrote this innocuous little piece for the Harvard Business Review called "The World Needs ESG Accounting Standards." I didn't pick that title either, just like I didn't pick the title of this talk. I just let people pick titles, whatever they want. So it gets published. It's 1,200, 1,300 words. What did it say? Basically said the ISSB is a good thing. Companies should support it. Information for investors, kind of comparability. You can compare yourself to competitors. More hate mail. It is the most views I have ever gotten on LinkedIn. And the hate mail just went on. Bob, I told you the last time, you're doing it again. It's not accounting, it's not ESG, it's this, nah. Like, wow, people are feeling passionate about this. Single materiality, don't like a single materiality. It's the I question mark SB. It's not real sustainability. Dull materiality, contextual materiality. And somebody writes and says, it's nice to have this conversation. It's always good to have a debate. Maybe we could be a little bit more polite about this. This is a woman from a foundation. Who are you to say this? What is the moral credibility of the foundation if you're saying this and the other thing? So that this is getting out of control. So I have a friend who's a millennial. She said they're called trolls and you can block them. I did. They're gone. They were like polluting my LinkedIn platform. So they're gone. Okay, so it's like the Taliban, nothing's ever good enough, right? Unless you get everything and you ignore all of the practical constraints we've been talking about, it's not good enough. So that's them. We've talked about the opportunists where they're kind of greenwashing on the company side and the corporate side. The flat earthers is actually an interesting story, the way it emerged, and it was first came to my attention when former Vice President Mike Pence penned an op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal, and he's kind of complaining about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And it is this seditious left-wing movement to impose leftist values on companies. I thought, wow, we're really come a long way, baby. ESG, nobody knew what it was, and now the Taliban hate ESG because it's only about helping companies make money. Mike Pence comes out, and he hates ESG because it's interfering with companies make money, and he's rattling on at some speech he gives in Houston about engine number one, and I know the whole engine number one thing. I know the people on the engine number one side and the Calster side. Put 3 environmentalists on the board that are undermining the company from within. Well, they put 3 people with oil and gas experience on the board of ExxonMobil, all right, so that they were kind of making better decisions on capital allocation. Like, okay, we're not going to sort of deal with facts on this. That's okay. Then we get something called the Republican Study Committee memo that comes out, the war on American energy, ground zero. ESG is this, nefarious left-wing woke political thing to interfere with, the ability of the American energy to supply energy security to, God-fearing Americans. It's like, man, have you looked at ExxonMobil's stock price? Did you look at their last investor presentation, $100 billion in free cash flow over the next 5 years? Look like they're doing pretty okay to me, big guy. And so, the hot buttons on this are climate change and DE&I. Then you have the red states. Oh, and there's this guy whose name I forget. I'm probably blocking on it on purpose, who's the Attorney General of West Virginia, who's already told the SEC that he's going to sue them on their climate disclosure proposal, and you get into this stuff, the major questions doctrine, which is legal stuff I won't talk about. Man, we don't even agree on single materiality in the United States, let alone this double materiality stuff you people are all sort of worried about, right? And so he's announced to the SEC he's going to sue him. Then the red states have got this, group, the State Financial Officers Foundation, and they've kind of formed this cabal. And they said, we're going to go after these asset managers that are not fossil fuel friendly, by God. Some guy named Chuck Hagar who's running for comptroller. This is like this big, kind of political campaign. So they come up with a list of 10 asset managers that, they're going to exclude. You're not going to invest in them. Not going to let you do business with them. Okay, BlackRock, everybody likes to beat up on BlackRock on the left and the right, and it's a bunch of, Scandinavian, asset managers. They don't invest for you guys anyway. They don't probably want to, so like whatever. And then they passed this Texas boycott provision, Section 809, and I've read that, and it's like nuts, right? It's like the intent was to damage a fossil fuel company if they're not doing anything more than required by regulation. All of these big oil and gas companies are not required by regulation. They are reporting on carbon emissions in their given target, so they don't even count. Then they say, and if this violates fiduciary duty, there's no private right of action, which means you can't sue the government. It's like nutso, right? But there's this big campaign, and so we're all going to pull our pension funds. Louisiana, we're going to pull $794 million out of BlackRock. Who's good at math in here? What percentage is 794 million of 8.5 trillion? It's 1/10,000th. So I don't think, BlackRock is economically suffering too much from Louisiana. Now, the ironic thing is that because this is such a politically driven thing, and it's anti-fiduciary duty in my view, who's going to pay the price? It's the citizens in the red states. There's a professor at Wharton that did a study with this guy that had been at the Reserve Bank, so they, they excluded all these big banks from a bond offering. It's going to cost them $300 to $500 million more, because they had to do it with a regional bank. So there's real economic consequences. So you have this just fascinating thing where you've got sort of the Taliban hating ESG because it's basically not double materiality. It's like, I get it, but you can't, be step by step. And you got the flat earthers that are kind of claiming they put a definition on ESG that isn't a definition that I would use, but they've given it political salience. And it's so remarkable to me that it's taken on political salience like abortion in the United States and guns in the United States. Is it going to kind of have sort of a long run of these other things? I kind of don't think so. But it's become sort of this issue that is sort of mobilizing the base by saying, you know, ESG is this sort of nefarious left-wing thing. So I understand, you know, Mike Pence would like to be president, and he wasn't treated very well by Trump when he didn't, you know, kind of say that the election was stolen. And Ron DeSantis probably wants to be president, so he's not going to be one-upped by Mike Pence. They passed legislation in Florida, we will have no ESG in our pension funds. And I'm like, okay, how would you even find it? You don't even know what it is. So how are you going to go find this ESG stuff in your pension funds and you're going to root it out? So the analytical issue is very clear. Do you think material risk factors matter? I wrote a piece called A Tutorial on ESG Investing in the Oil and Gas Industry for Mr. Pence and his friends, and I hope it was helpful. Because I looked at the SASB material issues for the 4 industries and non-renewable resources, and you look at the material risk factors. I'm not talking about, you know, the implications of Scope 3. I get it's a different thing. And it's kind of hard to believe that you wouldn't find any oil and gas company managing these in a responsible way. What the Republican Study Committee likes to do, gets back to the second story, and Mr. Pence, there's an irony in this. They go, you know what? ESG ratings, this is so stupid. In addition to being sort of this left-wing thing, these ESG ratings, look at this. ExxonMobil's got a better ESG rating than Tesla. First of all, entertaining that you're throwing ExxonMobil under the bus, you know, because they've got a good ESG rating. You're confounding, once again, you're confounding ESG and impact. So ExxonMobil's pretty buttoned down in terms of their operations. Yeah, there's a lot of negative impact that comes from these products and services, and solving that's complicated because a lot of it's going to be on the downstream. Tesla electric cars, good, you know, positive outcome. You know, issues around where does the electricity come from, you know, when you plug in your car, I've got a Tesla, coal plants or whatever, and then just ignore the problems of the supply chain. The reason Tesla gets a poor ESG rating is because of labor practices, which is one of only 4 material issues for an automotive company. And, you know, it's got a pretty hostile culture, you know, and it's anti-union, and so there's all kinds of issues. So it's not surprising at all. And I think if you could just distinguish between values and values-based investing, you can distinguish between material risk factors and positive and negative externalities, and kind of let go of all this sort of political campaigning, then it would be a constructive thing to do, but it's not clear that that's going to happen because it's so polarized in the United States, and it's so extraordinary to see. And I got to tell you, like coming here, I might as well be on Mars, man. It's like, here's this, you know, debate going on where fiduciary duty, you're violating your fiduciary duty if you include this ESG stuff. No, you're actually fulfilling your fiduciary duty if you're including this ESG stuff because it kind of matters to long-term returns, as we were talking about earlier. And so then I meet with Claudia and I talk to the folks at PGGM. Man, you're like down with the ESG integration. That's like, you know, table stakes. And now we're talking about outcomes and we're talking about how those are consistent with fiduciary duty and related to returns. And I think that's great. And I've got a question I'll ask you at the end, but should we take some questions? A couple questions, and maybe I'll tell you the 4th story is in its early stages, so it may not take as long. Anybody want this football? So this is good. There's like 2 people close to each other. So like one of your, like in football parlance, American football, not your football, you know, which I don't understand, and the scores are too low, so it's kind of boring. There's like offense and defense. So he's like the person I'm trying to get it to, because he's the offensive receiver, you're defense. So you need to try and grab it before he gets it, because you're defense. Got it? Okay. Okay, nicely done.
So, Professor Eccles, my question is very simple, and I'm very curious to know your answer. Will ESG investing survive its crucible? The question on the board. What would your answer be to that question?
Well, I didn't give the title to the talk, you know, so I'll say what I said in the beginning. I think it will. I think it'll be stronger. I think all of the pushback that you're getting from both the left and the right on all the greenwashing that was done, I think that's a healthy thing. I think it is forcing, I'm supposed to stay in the lights, I think it's forcing us to be analytically clear about ESG integration versus outcomes and impact. I'm dubious that the term ESG has got, kind of a lot of life left. I don't think it's going to immediately disappear. I think it's much better to frame the conversation in terms of things that I think are harder to politicize, like material risk factors. That's kind of boring. That's probably good. And positive and negative externalities, that's kind of boring, but that's probably good too. So I think it will survive. I think we'll be much clearer about value versus value-based. I think we'll be much clearer about ESG integration versus outcomes. I think we'll be clear about whether we're trying to achieve single and double materiality. I think we're going to be clear about where we're trying to divide the line between what the public sector do and what the private sector can do. And I think we're going to have kind of clear fund labeling. So I think there's a lot of positive things that have come out of that, and I think a lot of the political theater will probably disappear. But I think the broad term of ESG investing, I hope it goes away. I mean, when I talk to asset managers, they go, it's just investing. I mean, if we really believe that these issues are kind of relevant to value creation, which is different from the positive and negative externalities, why wouldn't you take these into account just like all the other risk factors that you do when you're making an investment decision? Capital, debt costs, political risk and whatever. So a good thing would be is that, we have investing that incorporates ESG factors, and we're talking about investing that is around kind of producing sustainable outcomes. We've got more clarity on that. And I do see, to the lady in the back, who you really set me up. I mean, you were pretending like you wanted the football, but it was like, I'm going to throw it at you at the end. And fair enough. I mean, I think what's happening in Europe is quite interesting. And it may take time. But there's this divergence. It's like Europe is sort of going, well, you're on the left, so you're my left, so you're going to go in this direction. And then there's a part of the States that's kind of in the same sort of mental place you are. And then there's a part of the States that I described as very different. And so for them, ESG investing is just a bad thing. And for me, ESG investing is too general of a term. That's my sense. So do you want to pass it back to the offensive receiver that didn't get it?
Of course. Which one was it? Who has the question?
Didn't you have your hand up? This guy? You didn't? No? Friend? Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, it's you again.
Yeah,
You're the woman that doesn't want me to throw you the football. You just like, when it's like next to you, you ask for it. So,
Sure.
yeah.
That's my gig. Just saying, you talk about US, you talk about Europe. How about the rest of the world? So China, India, where are we going? Are they? I know that China is going in a similar direction as Europe in some sense, but what do you think? Do they play a role in the global discussion on these aspects?
Boy, China's really complicated.
Yeah.
This is kind of above my pay grade. They've invested a lot in renewables and they've done a lot in green bonds. Mm-hmm. To be perfectly honest, I think Xi Jinping making himself emperor for life is, one of the scariest things I've seen in a long time. So it's like, the issues in China are like so much bigger than kind of the things we're talking about here. My Chinese friends that I talk to, they become so cautious on WeChat and on Zoom. I mean, it's just like, man, he's like the next Chairman Mao, and we're going to be having Xi Jinping thought. And I don't think it's going to end well. He's surrounded himself, by a bunch of toadies, and nobody disagrees with him. And I think they're going to lurch from one dynasty to the next, and how long it's going to take, I don't know. So, and the tensions between China and the U.S. are going to get greater, and I worry about what's going to happen in Taiwan. So China is like, man. And in terms of the polarization, you see it in the United States, you see it in the UK some, and you see it in Brazil. Those are the kind of three countries. And sort of India, I'm just less familiar with, but that's another big economy.
Yeah.
So why don't I try and really quickly, we can do this? Oh, man, nice. Nice. Okay, we'll do this, and then we can take a few questions, and then you can go, what's it called, the market? That fancy thing that, can you go to the market hall? Go to the market hall, buy some food. So here's the fourth story. Early stages, the building the bridges story. So I wrote this lovely piece. So proud of it. grift capitalism, the GOP's brilliant strategy for ripping off ordinary Americans. Wrote it with great gusto. Publish it. All my lefty friends, man. Right on, Bob. Here we go. Summarize all the stuff, that I've been talking with you folks about. I get an email from a friend of mine named Dan Crowley. He's a lawyer in D.C. K&L Gates. He's a Republican. Known him for a long time. He says, "Dear Bob, read your piece. I'm disappointed. It's beneath you. You are simply putting fuel on the rhetorical fire. Why are you trying to annoy Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican politician, if you probably know the name, when he's going to be the next Speaker of the House? And the Supreme Court isn't rogue, because I called the Supreme Court rogue, over Roe v. Wade and the New York gun law and the EPA." And I wrote back, I said, "Dear Dan, thank you for your note. I didn't start this fight." Mike Pence was the one that called this kind of seditious, left-wing, agenda to sort of impose left-wing values on American companies. Nothing I can do. Who's going to be the Speaker of the House? Kevin doesn't know me. If he did, he wouldn't like me, so whatever. And let's put the Supreme Court aside, because that's not really what the central issue is here on this. And I said, "Let's talk." So we set up a call. He said, "Bob, sustainability is absolutely fundamental. Got to start there. Capital markets have an important role to play." I said, "Bob, what you have to understand is when you say sustainability to Republican, they think AOC, Green New Deal, Europe." I should be going the other way, to my left, or to your left. AOC, Green New Deal, Europe, Marxism, and we don't like it. So here I am with like 100 Marxists. It's worse than being a socialist. So I said, "That's interesting. Fair point." So we decide, this polarization isn't getting us anywhere. So we wrote a piece, and really the impetus was his idea, this is full credit, called "Turning Down the Heat in the ESG Debate, Separating Material Risk Disclosures from Salient Policy Issues." We published it in this Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance. And he's very knowledgeable about financial services and how these various disclosure laws have evolved. And what we said is, and in his thesis, when we were talking about it, he said, "Look, investors want information on material risks that companies know they have. They want to disclose. And so, it's fair enough that this information be made available to investors. But we need to kind of separate out the kind of, investor disclosure issue from policy issues. Climate change being an obvious one, and, opinion will vary. The question on regulation, how much should it be regulation? How much should it be market forces?" So we published this piece, and then we're going to try and get it as a reduced piece in Wall Street Journal, an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal. And we send it in, and they write back, and they said, "No, thank you, it doesn't fit our narrative." And I mean, wait a second, op-ed piece, it's supposed to be like a different point of view. Maybe I got that wrong, I'm kind of old, maybe I'm missing something here. And then like a couple weeks later, they published a piece by a guy named Nathan Fabian, who's the head of policy for the Principles for Responsible Investment, that was basically in defense of ESG. And I said to Dan, "Well, gee, that's kind of odd, they published this guy's piece, why not ours?" He said, "Bob, you don't understand. He's not a turncoat." And I thought, oh, interesting. So it's like, okay, here's something called the Principles of Responsible Investment. Most of our readers don't know what it is. They won't like it because of the name. So yeah, we'll give this, little guy, 15, lines or whatever, and so life will go on, and we can say that we publish op-ed pieces. So we decided, look, we've got to really try to do something about this. And so we're launching our little GOP outreach campaign, and it's in the early stages, and it's been fascinating. I've learned a lot talking to Dan. I've learned, what Republicans, kind of basically, they have different political views, but climate change is real and we need to deal with it. Some don't, so who can you talk to, who you can't? I during Climate Week, gave a couple talks. I was on a thing in the Harvard Club, this group put on, there was 100 people. I'm like the closing fireside chat speaker. This guy, asked me this and that and the other thing, and people asked me stuff, and I said, let me ask you guys a question. I said, how many people in this room are Republican? 0. Not a one. This is like a conference on, kind of sustainable investing, right? And how many people know a Republican? Like 3. And how many people think my campaign's a bad idea? A couple people. Good idea, most people. How many people think I'm going to make progress? A few hands go down, not a lot. 2 days later, I'm at an S&P conference. There's more people, there's 250 people, same thing. How many people in here are Republican? 3 people in the back raised their hands. I said, you're in the back of the room where you belong, right? Making friends everywhere. They actually all came up and talked to me, had a great conversation. How many people know Republican? About 5. So this is very telling. Everybody's living in their little bubble. So afterwards, I'm chatting with Doug Peterson, who's the CEO of S&P, who was in the session, and we're kind of talking about, how do you try and address this issue? And he tells me about a group called the Bipartisan Policy Committee, which is in DC, which has started a Senate ESG working group, of senators, 4 from the Republican Party, 4 from the Democratic Party. They're funded by a friend of mine, with the Ford Foundation. And I've talked to some very prominent Republicans. And when you talk to people in private, they get it. There is this issue, it's a scary issue in America, that Trump still has got his throats around that party. How he did this hostile takeover of the Republican Party is a scary and astonishing thing. But, I've discovered there's a young Republican group for climate change, and there's another Republican group for climate change. And so what we're trying to do is to see if we can create this space in the middle that's not, the Taliban, and it's not the flat earthers. And that's always harder, right? Because the pragmatic conversations aren't nearly as exciting and aren't nearly as energizing to the base. And you're talking with people whose views you don't agree with. In fact, you could have a lot of differences. And so it's not always going to be the most comfortable thing. And had a very interesting conversation with a guy who was very prominent, ran one of the presidential campaigns. And I was telling him about the Wall Street Journal story. And he said, look, he said, that's kind of entertaining, but don't worry about it so much. He says that the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, they don't really matter. So what matters is the local newspapers. He says, go ahead and meet with some of these, staffers in Congress, after the elections. But they're going to follow, they're not going to lead. And so what you want to do is publish in the local newspaper. So the Orlando Sentinel, if such a thing exists, or the Arizona Sun, if something exists, I don't know. Because when an issue comes up, then the staffers who've got to deal with all these things, they just go to the local newspaper. It's like, oh, here's some professor from Harvard and Oxford said something. So, well, maybe they won't like me because I live in Massachusetts, but, okay, so this is probably the way to think about it. It's been very interesting because when you're not in the public glare and you're not kind of trying to perform for your tribe, you can have very reasonable conversations with people. There's a bunch of things you're not going to agree with them on. I've talked to some CEOs about this. I've talked to some asset managers. It's tricky because the corporate community in the United States sort of feels like they're catching fire from the left and the right. It's either not enough or you're going to go in too much. And so trying to find people that will be public spokesmen for this. It can't just be me. And I have a lot of degrees of freedom, obviously, in terms of what I can say, as you tell. And it's like I'm a professor. Nobody cares what I think. And so, I have to work for a responsible organization. I don't have a chief compliance officer or a PR department or anything like that, so I can say whatever I want. Other people have responsible jobs, so it's a little bit trickier. But I think there's a way to do this. And I think you can start it with climate change in the United States. I think the DE&I thing is much more complicated for a bunch of reasons. But I think the language has to change. And I think, climate crisis is hysterical. That's not going to resonate. I think extreme weather events, I think talking about what's happening to farmers, in the red states, You can talk about that. You can talk about energy security. You can talk about American competitiveness. You can talk about innovation. Do we want to let China get ahead of us, in terms of green technologies? Do we want to let all you Marxists with your EU taxonomy get ahead of us in terms of new technologies? And as I said earlier, I think you need to have conversations about issues, not so much the broad topics. So there's climate change, I get it. There's an energy transition, I get it. There's jobs, there's coal, there's natural gas, there's nuclear, and people have very strong feelings about these things. And I think until you can find a way to have people that have got very different points of view willing to come and have a conversation about it, rather than simply writing off the person who has a different point of view, you're not really going to get anywhere. So let me end this. It's spot on. It's 15. You know what? I don't like the 24-hour clock. I got to tell you, I've never gotten used to the 24-hour clock. It's such a pain in the ass. Every time I get something in a 24-hour clock, then I'm sitting there in Boston, and I go, well, it was 1500. I got to try 12, and that's 3, and then I'm 5 hours, earlier than that. So it takes me 30 seconds just to sort of book a Zoom appointment. But why don't you people start using a normal clock? It's called AM and it's called PM. Here's the question. Do you think all this stuff that's happening in the United States, do you think it matters to you in the Netherlands or not? Does it matter to you or not? What do you think? So we just close it out and we can talk about that outside? What do you think? Think about it. Right? You're like in a good place in lots of ways, but you're a small place, and we're a big place. And I think if we don't get it right, you can get it right. To be honest, it's not going to matter. So I think it does matter. But it's not your responsibility, but I think it's something you need to think about. And wish Dan and me luck with our GOP outreach campaign. I'm going to go make friends with Republicans. If I come back here to Rotterdam, hopefully to actually see some of the city, you won't even recognize me. I'm going to be so different. Thanks. Appreciate it.